All right. Hi, everybody. My name's Madeline. I go by Maddie from Firefly Children and Family Alliance, which is a dual program in Marion County, Indianapolis area for survivors of both domestic violence and sexual assault. So brief content warning, hopefully from the agenda and Core 40, everybody kind of knows what they're in for, but just because you know what we're going to talk about doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to discuss. So just want to acknowledge that here at the beginning. I will not be offended at all if you have to take a break or disengage for a little bit. Taking care of yourself is the important thing. And since we are in a training space here, we're going to be focusing on kind of the topics and education rather than sharing personal stories, just because this wouldn't be a space where we'd be able to give them the attention they deserve. But yeah, take care of yourself. You come first, even during a training for work. And if you ever need to ground yourself in the training, this is a little graphic that we like to share of just kind of a quick grounding exercise. And so getting us started, the point of learning about this topic in particular is that it will help you not only in your role, but just in general, since we know that survivors are everywhere. Being able to understand at a deep level, what the impacts are for survivors of sexual violence so that you can truly be trauma informed in your work with them. And I imagine we might all already know, but just to kind of set a common foundation for how our advocacy program defines trauma, we're going to be looking at it as an overwhelming experience that creates a feeling of danger, either physically and or emotionally, that causes harm either physically and or emotionally, and that makes a person feel they have lost control either partially or fully, that this thing is happening to them, that they feel kind of powerless in that moment, and that has sort of long-term significant impacts afterwards. So again, something that is overwhelming, makes a person feel like they have lost control, causes physical and or emotional harm, has those long-term impacts afterwards. And when we're thinking about the impacts of that trauma, we're thinking about supporting survivors in normalizing and validating what their experience is afterwards so that they are having a normal reaction to what we would hope is an abnormal event. Um, and really wanting to ensure that the ways that we communicate with survivors and react to them does everything we can to make them feel understood, supported, and try to take away some of those feelings that many survivors have of feeling like they're weird or alone in what they're experiencing and all of that. Short version of this whole presentation is basically just that there's not a cookie cutter way for survivors to be impacted. I think it is always important to remember that, even though there may be certain impacts that we do see very frequently in survivors, we still want to always keep an open mind that not every single survivor is going to show even those most frequently seen impacts, and keeping a perspective of believing survivors not only about the trauma that they are telling us about in a disclosure, but also about the impacts that they are telling us about, believing for those impacts as well. And to help get us started in kind of looking at a range of different impacts that trauma has on the brain, we have a little animated video here. I'm going to get that started for us.
You need to take a statement so we can establish what happened on Saturday.
What time did you get back to David's flat?
What time? I don't know.
Can you give us an estimate?
I don't remember.
Would your pals remember what time you left the club?
He seemed nice.
She didn't remember much, did she?
I know. And now we've got to waste more time on a daft lecture. We know how to deal with victims. We've had years of experience.
Well, some of us have had more years than others.
I'm in my prime, I'll have you know.
That'll be right.
Today's session is about trauma. The latest in brain science will help you in your work. I'll start with a tour of the parts of the human brain. The reptilian brain maintains basic bodily functions. The limbic system is also instinctive. It deals with fear and pleasure. For example, you pat a dog, it senses pleasure, and without thinking, wags its tail. The neocortex is the site of logic, imagination, planning, and control. It's more sophisticated, but because it's conscious, it's slower than the older parts of the brain. The amygdala is a key part of the limbic system. It has one job: to sense danger and set off the alarm. When it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are three possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze. When the alarm goes off, blood and oxygen are diverted to muscles, adrenaline floods the body, and all systems that are not crucial to survival are switched off. Normally, the job of the hippocampus is to file memories so you can retrieve them later. But in times of danger, it stops filing memories, which makes it harder to gather evidence later on. Instead, the hippocampus switches to pumping cortisol. What's useful about cortisol is it stops us feeling pain, so we can focus on survival. Can anyone give me an example?
A farming accident where a man carried his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain?
Yes, excellent example. It is an evolutionary safety mechanism which is fast and instinctive. In essence, it's our body's very clever way of protecting us. To recap, an example of the three parts of the brain working together. You're standing at a bar. Your reptilian brain is keeping your heart beating. You're enjoying the pleasure of a nice pint with your limbic system. You're using your neocortex to work out if there's time for another before the last train. What could happen to make the amygdala kick in? What if this happened? The way you'd respond would depend not on your logical brain, but on your instinctive brain. Being glassed in a bar would be a traumatic experience. Who can give me another example of an event that can cause trauma?
War?
Rape?
A car crash?
Good, yes. Trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by something beyond their control. The survival brain takes over the rational brain. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with symptoms that last at least a month. Vicarious, or secondary trauma, is something you may experience if you deal with incidents such as rape, or sudden death, or think of Lockerbie, Dunblane. You're not superheroes. Having a brain makes you all vulnerable to secondary trauma. It's important to understand that when trauma occurs again and again, it can become complex PTSD, such as in domestic abuse or child sexual abuse. The alarm system in the brain becomes jammed. Memories are stuck in the limbic system, so a trigger can set off the alarm. The trigger could be anything: a colour, a smell, a sound, a sensation. Now, the indicators of trauma. What should you be looking out for?
Depression? Crying a lot?
Yes, that's one response. And at the other end of the spectrum, total numbness.
Nightmares? Flashbacks?
Stress?
Good, yes. And they may feel sick. Also, shame, feelings of guilt, inability to enjoy sex, social isolation, triggers. People often feel overwhelmed by the symptoms of trauma. This can lead to using alcohol or other drugs to block out memories, or self-harm, or dissociation when a person's mind detaches from reality. Indicators can be specific to the type of trauma. Say, dental problems, when someone who was orally abused avoids going to the dentist. A victim of abuse might bond strongly to her abuser. This is known as traumatic bonding, or Stockholm syndrome. And jumbled up memory, when a person's normal recording of memories doesn't work. Can you recall any times you've seen that symptom?
What time? I don't know.
A traumatized person may not seem like her usual self, or may be hypervigilant, on edge, or being startled by everyday things. Everyone is different. You never know what impact trauma will have. Symptoms can change from day to day. So what does all this mean? In practice, in your job, a traumatized person's brain is protecting them. But that normal human response of self-protection can get in the way of evidence gathering. The US military has developed new trauma-informed interviewing techniques that you can use to work around this. Research shows that if someone seems vacant, they could be distracted by their traumatic memories. Try to ground them by asking a simple, non-patronizing question such as, "Are you thirsty?
All right. Seems like Zoom is having issues again.
Want a glass of water?"
Sorry, everybody. Zoom is not my friend today. I'm going to just have us move past the video in this case, and I can kind of summarize the end because I've seen it a bunch of times. Okay, so essentially, as we kind of saw in the video, the point is to give admittedly a very simplified overview of the ways that a person's brain is affected by traumatic incidents and to show how the brain is very relevant to our experience of survivors. So, if they, as the video said, they may not seem like their normal selves, they may be showing signs of hypervigilance, reacting to things. So I know I kind of already got us started with a few, but if I could get 3 people to either come off mute and share or put in the chat what some of the immediate impacts of trauma that you recognized in the video or that you've already seen in your work. Open chat.
Good morning.
Good morning.
One that I would say is just a lack of wanting to be touched to control who can touch your body. I worked with a client who was going through a um, trial situation, and we were always very careful to ask her, do you want a hug? Do you need someone to hold your hand? You know, always letting her make sure she had that choice.
Yes, absolutely. Extremely common for survivors to be sensitive to touch. And great example of how we can then be trauma informed in our practice by modeling consent and, empowering survivors with choice. And, sometimes people do want you to hold their hand or things like that. And depending on your comfort level as a provider, that can be a good way to really be a human support for them. But for sure, that consent is vital. Thanks very much, Shannon.
Hi.
Hello.
One thing I see is maybe not about the incident, but like traumatic event, or maybe not even traumatic events, but like trauma inducing events afterwards. My clients have a really hard time remembering the details of even those events because they go into a trauma response and then their brain kind of has a hard time remembering any traumatic events or any high conflict events.
Yes, that brings up a great point that the impacts of trauma can affect not only the inciting incident, but as you mentioned, also like things that may happen afterwards. And that's something that we just want to be mindful of when we're working with folks that, that memory challenge doesn't just apply to the incident itself. Thanks.
I've seen many clients like minimize and deny and try and take the blame as to try to understand why it happened.
Yes, for sure. Taking blame, as you said, is kind of a way for a survivor to feel like, okay, there was some level of control for me in that situation. Somehow things that I said or did were, a piece of the puzzle as to why things happened. And that means that going forward, I can change what I say or do to try to protect myself and prevent this from happening in the future. And so, although we obviously want to let survivors know that it wasn't their fault and that they don't deserve to have to carry shame or blame, we can still see kind of the emotional logic of where that reaction is coming from, of a desire to feel like there's something in their control that they can change to protect themselves going forward. Thanks very much for our 3 volunteers there. Appreciate it. And we saw in the video that there were 3 trauma responses that were highlighted. In our program, we recognize a 4th, which, to keep with the kind of F acronym here, we use the term fawn, just in the sense of like, it is often necessary for survivors to essentially try to de-escalate or appease the perpetrator to prevent even further harm from happening, to try to, protect themselves in the situation the best that they can. And so you may hear survivors sharing with you that they feel like things were their fault or that, they were a part of it because they went along with something that the perpetrator was asking them to do, or because they, were making those efforts to appease and de-escalate the perpetrator. And, something that I think is often helpful to highlight for survivors in those types of situations is just asking them, well, in that situation, did you feel like it would have been safe for you to say no to that person, safe for you to disengage, safe for you to get yourself out of there? And most often the person's answer is going to be, no, I didn't feel safe. I felt like I had to do these things in order to survive the situation. And that can be a helpful way for us to remind them, like, okay, well, then that wasn't truly consent. You were just doing what you needed to do to try to get through that situation as safely as you could. And, you don't deserve to blame yourself or feel shame for doing what you had to do to survive. So that's what I'll say for that piece. And then, as one of our participants just highlighted, it may take time for survivors' brain and body to come out of survival mode. And depending on triggers or other stress or potentially even new incidents of trauma, those trauma responses may return and may essentially just kind of be barriers for that person when they're trying to go about their daily life. I will skip this video since videos are apparently making Zoom crash today. But it was just a video to highlight the freeze response as one that particularly does come up a lot with sexual assault survivors and is one that people can feel a lot of like confusion and even fear around of like, I don't understand. My body just froze up. I could barely even think. Like, that's never happened to me before. I don't, and that's a place where, once again, part of our role here is to educate and normalize and say that, that is a normal reaction to sexual assault, that they're not the only one who's experienced that it is not anything wrong with their body and is in fact a normal survival response when we are so overwhelmed that our body just kind of shuts down. Also highlighted the dissociation piece, scattered memory and thought. And, you might get some survivors who are eating a lot to comfort themselves or feel like they can hardly eat anything. There's definitely a lot of overlap between trauma and eating disorders for sure. And I've worked with multiple clients who were at that intersection. So basically, once again, just keeping an open mind about the impacts and believing the survivor not only about the incident they experienced, but also the impacts that they're going through. And, even if they're telling you that they're not experiencing nightmares, for example, is a really common one. You might have gotten to a point in your career where so many clients have experienced nightmares that you're kind of expecting that to be what most clients experience. And we want to remember that not everyone will. See something in the chat there. Would you say that doing things to their own bodies to regain control is a common response? Yeah, I mean, basically anything that allows a survivor to regain a sense of control, whether that's doing something to their own body or, including like controlling what you eat or, self-isolating as a way of controlling like who is around them and, feeling like they can't trust other people. Yeah, there are all kinds of coping skills that on the surface we might be like, ooh, that seems kind of concerning. But when you kind of take a second to understand where that's coming from, it might be something that the survivor experiences as protective. That doesn't necessarily mean that those things are always healthy necessarily, but we want to try to avoid being, judgmental and prescriptive and try to understand where those things are coming from. So then a brief review of some stats. A lot of studies that exist around impacts on survivors of sexual assault do tend to focus on people who identify as women. And so that's where some of these stats are coming from. I would generally encourage you to just kind of overall in the various gender identities of clients that you serve, just to essentially be prepared that it is very frequent that sexual assault survivors will experience symptoms of PTSD, at least in the short term. Many those symptoms will last even in the long term, and things like contemplating or even attempting suicide are also, unfortunately, something that many survivors do experience. And so, beyond the scope of this training, but making sure that in your own team, like, you have conversations about like what to do if a survivor is really in a tough place and what are those crisis mental health resources that feel like actual good referrals that you can give to survivors, and what are like emotional safety plans that you can go through with a survivor that gives them a plan of various different healthy coping skills, sources of support, etc. So just highlighting here that mental health impacts in particular are some of the most common and, most impactful things that we see a lot. And just kind of further highlighting that, it is very normal, even beyond mental health impacts, for their survivor's life to be disrupted in other ways, whether they feel that they are no longer able to keep up with work or they're trying to keep up with work, but they are not at their same level of performance that they used to be. So they might end up losing a job or having troubles at job, or if they're in school, having that same effect. So just lots of different ways that this can really touch a person's life. And I think there is something else in the chat. Yes, reporting numbers are generally going to be low, and there are many different reasons, valid reasons, as to why survivors might choose not to report. And at least in our program, as long as the person is 18 and older, we in no way pressure or require survivors to report. We help them understand their options so that they can make an informed choice, but we don't pressure them to do that, since, the last thing we want to do is further make the survivor feel like things are out of their control. Shifting now into the possible long-term impacts. Let's see, we're at 11:05, so we got about 20-ish minutes left. This is kind of a funky little graph that we use to basically illustrate a phrase that you may have already heard and that we'll probably hear many times throughout your career in survivor services, which is that healing is not linear. And, certain areas of a survivor's life might be doing better than others at a given point. Survivor might feel like they've been making a lot of progress, and then something happens like a trigger or a stressor, and it kind of knocks them down for a little while. And a very common thing that I've heard from a lot of clients is, doubting whether it's ever going to get any better, doubting whether they're truly making progress if they still have a really tough time sometimes. And so I think it can be helpful for us as service providers to remind them that it is normal for these ups and downs to happen, and that even when they do experience a setback or a tough time, it doesn't erase all of the progress that has happened before then, and that if they continue to engage in support services, if they continue to set goals for their well-being and healing and working through those things, that they will experience gradual progress over time, but that it's normal for it to take longer than we wish it would, be harder than we wish it would, and have more ups and downs than we would prefer. So then just kind of briefly going through those different categories. The point of this section is just to kind of illustrate that, unfortunately, there's really not much of a limit to how trauma can affect a person's life. There are lots of different ways that it can affect someone's day-to-day. So just to highlight a few from physical, there may have been STIs from the assault, there may have been an unwanted pregnancy, there may have been physical injuries, lots of different ways that can affect a person's physical health. And then we touched a little bit already on the mental health impacts. Questioning safety and hypervigilance, that's a big one. I hear from a lot of clients that they don't feel comfortable being in crowded public spaces, that it's harder for them to just go out and feel comfortable in public in general, harder than it used to be. The flashbacks are intrusive thoughts, remembering that a flashback is an experience where someone feels like they are truly reliving that incident, not just recalling it in the way that we would recall normal memories. And I mentioned earlier the nightmares or trouble sleeping. I've heard from many clients that they either are sleeping way more often than they used to as a way to try and have a break from, the tough stuff going through their head, or the opposite, that it's very hard for them to fall asleep, stay asleep, that they deal with a lot of trauma-related nightmares. So again, being prepared to normalize that extremes on either end of the spectrum can both be a potential option. Social impacts is a big one that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on, since we haven't talked about this one as much yet. So basically, if we're putting ourselves in the survivor's shoes where someone has sexually assaulted them, and we might already know that, unfortunately, people are most likely to be assaulted by someone that they know, whether that's a coworker, neighbor, friend, family member, whoever that is. So if we're working within this realm where a survivor has been sexually assaulted by someone that they know, how are you going to feel after that happens? Well, it's going to feel harder to trust people, because you knew this person, maybe they weren't your best friend necessarily, but you didn't see them as a danger necessarily, or maybe they did seem kind of creepy, but you figured they probably wouldn't actually hurt you, and so then to be now in this whole new world, basically, where this person that you knew has hurt you in this way, that is going to create a major disruption most of the time for your ability to feel comfortable and trust people. Wondering like, how do I really know if someone is safe? What's the difference between, for example, someone who just seems kind of creepy but is ultimately not going to hurt me versus like someone who is going to hurt me? Or, it just creates a lot of upheaval. And furthermore, other people's reactions, if the survivor chooses to disclose or if other people just become aware, are going to also create potential social issues depending on whether people believe the survivor, whether they decide to not believe the survivor and take the side of the perpetrator, if the survivor feels comfortable continuing to be in whatever space it was that they were in when they knew that perpetrator, whether that's they might feel like they need to leave their job, they might feel like they need to move from the area that they lived in. I also have a lot of clients who, although there are people in their lives that care about them and want to support them, those people don't really have the same, education and training that service providers have to be able to be a truly trauma-informed support person. And so survivors often end up feeling like they can't talk about things at the level that they wish they could talk about it and really be honest about how much this is affecting them. And so that can kind of further create this feeling of loneliness. So I spend a little bit of time on this one just because it is one that over the past, over 3.5 years that I've been in this role, I have really seen a lot of examples of survivors who are socially impacted, who feel isolated, who feel like they have a limited support network, who feel like people judge them or don't believe them, all of that type of stuff. And so that is one just to be on the lookout for. And we talked about how you can do like an emotional or, kind of mental health safety plan with survivors to talk about coping skills. Part of that plan can also be thinking about like, who are this survivor's support people? And if they don't really feel like they have any support people, then how can we try to, in our role, model what healthy support should look like and encourage them to take steps, whether that's joining a support group or whatever that looks like, to kind of decrease some of that isolation. And then possible spiritual impacts. Spirituality, we can look at both in the sense like of faith and religion, but also just in the sense of like a person's general understanding of meaning in the world, their place in the world, their purpose in life, etc. And so that can really be shaken when stuff like this happens because, I've heard survivors say things like, well, now it kind of makes me feel like I just have this jaded, pessimistic, view of the world that people hurt people, that, I tried to report, but the prosecutor's office didn't take my case. So now I feel like the system kind of failed me. And that's really depressing. It can really affect a person's understanding of what the world is like, what other people are like. For some, it may be an experience where faith becomes part of that support and they feel like their practice of their faith is something that is comforting to them. For others, especially if they either experienced the assault from someone who was in a religious structure, their religious community, or if they turned to that community for support and that community was not supportive, then that can obviously have the opposite effect of making someone feel like that faith community is no longer available to them. Lots of different ways. And that's kind of what I mean when I say that, like, unfortunately, there's not a lot of limits to how this can affect a person's life, because it really just does become such a almost like litmus test, if you've ever heard that word, of like, well, now this thing has happened to me. It was really important. It's affected me really painfully and really powerfully. And if people don't believe me or don't support me about what happened and about what I'm going through afterwards, then how can I really feel safe and healthy and comfortable around them? And then financial impacts here. So, if the survivor has to get a lawyer, maybe they're needing to divorce the person who hurt them, or maybe they need to get a protective order. You don't have to have a lawyer to get a protective order, but, maybe they need one for their case. Therapy costs. especially with the cost of healthcare in general in this country. Lost money, like I said, if they lose a job or have to drop out of school or things like that. And it's very common for survivors to feel like they want or need to relocate after trauma, whether because the assault occurred like in their home. I've unfortunately had clients where that was the case, or because the perpetrator knows where they live and they don't feel comfortable staying in a place where they know that address and everything. So, um, just really trying to keep an open mind about what a survivor is sharing with you. And, trying to once again normalize that they're not the only one who is going through this, that they're not weird or high maintenance or, anything else like that for the needs that they may have when they're going through their journey towards healing. I know I listed many different examples, but does anyone have anything that they want to add, whether that's something that, was an example that I didn't bring up, or just any quick comments or questions or anything at this point?
Maddie, there is a question in the chat that I
Right.
have kind of gotten to, but I'm not sure if you specifically called it out.
Was it would you say that doing things to their own bodies to regain control is a common response, or a different one?
Yeah, it's that one. I think that's the only one.
Okay. Yeah, so really anything that helps a survivor to feel like they regain control, whether that's something that they do to their own body or a way that they set boundaries with other people in their lives, or, feeling like they need to change a lot of things in their life in order to like get themselves as far away from like the circumstances that they feel in some way, connected to what happened, or that, can help them get away from the perpetrator and feel like that person no longer has access to them. Control is going to be a big thing. And part of our role with empowering a survivor is to help them recognize that they deserve to be able to make changes in their lives, to feel healthy and safe, that they're not, making too big a deal out of things, and that it makes sense that they would want to move, or that they would want to get a new job, or that they, and if someone is sharing something with you that you're a little concerned about as far as like whether that particular response or coping skill is healthy for them in the long term, I think it's always helpful to start from a place of curiosity rather than judgment, and just ask that person, like, where do you feel like that comes from? What does that particular habit, reaction, whatever, do for you? What does that give you? Do you have and they may not know at first, and that may be something to kind of talk through a bit. If they are open to therapy, encouraging them to get started with that, or to join a support group, or to, just have places where they're able to talk through those tough aspects of trauma impacts that, they may feel a little bit uncomfortable disclosing. Because one thing that I have seen a lot is that survivors are very aware that there's a high potential for judgment in other people, whether that's judgment about the incident itself and like, why didn't you call for help? Why didn't you fight back? Why did you even go around that person? Like, blah, 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 blah. Like those types of judgments, or judgments around like, well, you really should be doing this to get better. You really should be doing that to get better. Why are you doing this? That's not good for you. Like that kind of judgment is something that survivors get a lot of. And so we want to try as much as possible to not have that attitude, and to, even when we have something that we're concerned about, approach it from a perspective of curiosity, support, and, genuine concern for their well-being. So that's what I would say for that one. I'm going to quickly take us through our final section here, and then we'll have one last point for questions and comments. So couple words briefly here about being able to provide support. We've talked about all of the many different ways that this form of trauma can impact a survivor, both in the short and long term. So just a little bit of words here about how we can best support. Regardless of what your role is specifically, you can try to take the approach of an advocate in the way that you normalize, validate, and provide helpful information to survivors or to community in general. Encourage survivors to see their reactions to trauma as normal, valid, and understandable. Help them feel less alone. highlight the strengths and resiliencies that they do show and encouraging them to be able to feel proud of themselves for the tough things that they do, making sure that you are intentionally presenting yourself and your organization in a way that feels reliable, safe, trustworthy, and that you are aware of resources in the community for things like therapy, support groups, basic needs supports, because it's pretty hard to recover from trauma if you don't have your basic needs met. So, whatever your role is, these are things that we can all do or be educated around. Biggest thing is always going to be start by believing, because every time a survivor discloses, the experience can either be something that is validating and supportive to their healing, or that is damaging and further makes them feel a sense of shame and isolation. At this slide, I always like to say that there are certain things that don't go without saying. So you might feel like in your role supporting survivors of like, well, I'm an advocate or I'm a service provider. Like, of course they know I believe them. Well, it's still really helpful to actually say, I believe you. It wasn't your fault. I'm sorry this happened. Tell me as much or as little as you want. Those types of things to actively establish that sense of trust, safety, and consent, of like how much they tell you or, what things they do or don't want to work on with you. And letting them make their own choices when it comes to the services they want to engage in with you, the resource referrals that they want to engage in with things outside of your services, whether they want to report to police or not, all of those things. And just sort of generally letting them control their journey and their story. So who they tell, what information they share, when they tell, providing them with options and resources so that they can make informed decisions, but not pressuring them or trying to make decisions for them, even if it's coming from a good place of you feeling like, I really think this would be helpful for them if I could just convince them to, get them to do this thing, trying to resist the urge to do that. And if the assault has just happened, checking on immediate safety, being aware of what the hospitals are in your area, especially if they're hospitals that have like specific centers of hope, and, helping them to make choices in that moment of like, if you want to report or if you're not sure if you want to report, but you want to have the option, then a forensic exam can really be helpful. Even if you don't want to report, you can at least still get like the healthcare aspect of things by being seen at the hospital to check for STIs, check for injuries, check for, anything that might be unsafe health-wise. So that can be something for the immediate. And then just quickly, some resources and more information. This is our program here in Indianapolis and Marion County. And we do hospital response, safety planning, help with protective orders, court accompaniment. We do have in-house survivor counseling, although since it is grant funded, we do have a wait list. And we do have lots of support groups. And then I'll just quickly highlight this number here at the top, the 8. That is our 24/7 free and confidential crisis line in Marion County that anyone can use regardless of whether they are a client of Firefly or not, if they are having urgent safety planning or resource needs as a survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault. ICASA has a great service directory map on their website that is helpful if you're trying to find things in your area. And the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence has an equivalent for DV service providers. So this is our information. The yellow number there is our office number, which is the best way for clients to get a hold of us. And we are a voluntary program only, so we don't take like required referrals or anything. So if a survivor wants to get connected, they can reach out, or you can be with them if they reach out if they want. But we will need to talk with them to make sure that it's something that they truly want to do. But thank you very much. We appreciate that a lot. And that's everything I have. Once again, happy to answer any questions or comments or anything from the presentation, but that is the end of my content.